Let's spend a few minutes talking about gait and the relevance of the hip joint in absorbing shock. At heel strike, the hip goes into three motions. It goes into internal rotation, adduction, and slight flexion. Basically, the hip joint, every time you land, doesn't go like this. The hip goes into this three-dimensional movement to absorb shock. Let's go through each one of them. At first, as soon as we land, the hip falls into slight internal rotation. The reason that happens is because of the eccentric control of the gluteus maximus has the amazing control to eccentrically control the degree of internal rotation. In extreme cases, such as neurological cases such as children with cerebral palsy, that neurological control is gone. Therefore, they would walk in extreme like this. No matter how much they would try to prevent that internal rotation, they're unable to. However, in people with hip osteoarthritis, the hip doesn't fall into internal rotation. They in fact avoid internal rotation. They're limited because of a tight posterior capsule. They remain in external rotation. They lose that shock absorbency capacity that's so essential after heel strike. Because after every heel strike, the hip should ideally internal rotate. And typical OA, they walk with zero hip internal rotation. Next, at heel strike, the hip should adduct. The degree of adduction is controlled by the eccentric contraction of the hip abductors. Glute med, superior fibers of the glute max, tensor fasciae lata, glute min, the TFL. However, in people with hip osteoarthritis, that control is gone. They typically don't present with a Trendelenburg gait. They typically present with a gait that is with no hip adduction at all. Because they avoid hip abductor mechanisms because it typically produces pain. So what happens so far, we got the hip doesn't go into a rotation, nor does it go into adduction. Because the exaggerated gait would be that we all walk like this. That was an exaggeration, of course. Next, the third thing that happens at heel strike at the hip joint is internal rotation, adduction, and flexion that occurs. And the degree of flexion is controlled by the eccentric contraction of the hip extensors, primarily the glute max and the hamstrings. So what happens is, at every heel strike, we're technically doing this. That would be the ideal shock absorbency. However, a person with hip osteoarthritis typically, they avoid anything that involves eccentric contraction, control of the hip extensors. So technically, instead of doing this with every hip landing, a person with hip OA is doing this. The compensatory mechanisms that they have to compensate for their osteoarthritis and their pain is actually accelerating their osteoarthritis by repeatedly compressing their joint during gait. So what is the purpose of physiotherapy? Is to provide exercises to alter gait, to get this natural movement back in the fluidity of their walk. And that's when the clock exercises come in. Hope you enjoyed that brief review about gait. So next time you walk, try to be fluid. That's the best way to walk.